Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today we're going to talk about aerobic training for pitchers and how to do it without killing your velo gains. So in the past, training for pitchers has not been great or even necessarily science-based, right? I mean, you still have some coaches out there saying we run poles after our guys throw because lactic acid needs to be flushed out because that's what's making them sore. Not at all how it works, and if they understood even a little bit, they wouldn't base their training methodology on that. But that's kind of the problems we've seen in the past. So people kind of have gone really far the other way, where the assumption has become, all conditioning is bad, right? We've shunned poles, which is probably a good thing. I mean, we've even got the shirts to prove it with that. But is all aerobic conditioning really going to impact your velocity gains and your performance on field in a negative way? Let's talk about that. So one of the problems is I think conditioning is a really general term that needs to be more specifically defined, right? Because the conditioning demands for a marathon runner, right, where they're expected to move at a low to moderate intensity for a long period of time continuously, are probably not going to be the same as they are for a pitcher who's going to move for 1 to 2 seconds about every 20 seconds, right? I think we can see that they'll need to be trained differently. Baseball is primarily an anaerobic alactic sport. So what that means, kind of what we mentioned earlier, where we have these brief periods of high intensity followed by these relatively long periods of recovery, right? Certainly in terms of a work to rest ratio, we're working in that 1 to 10 or above range when we talk about pitching. So why should we even care about aerobic conditioning? Well, it carries with it a few benefits, especially being that, as we're going to discuss here a little bit later on, all energy systems are kind of always working. It's really a matter of what proportion they're in. So we are always using some of the aerobic system. So the better that is, it's going to have the following benefits. One is you're going to be able to recover better between pitches, right? So this means you'll be able to better sustain a high level of output throughout the game. The second is you're going to be able to handle an increased volume of high quality training, which if we think about that, that means faster and a higher level of development down the line. So it's a really important piece there. The other piece is you're going to have better recovery between games and training sessions, which again means a greater volume of high quality training sessions, more training in a given time period, and then improved development in on-field performance. Okay, so before we go on any further, here's a quick primer on the energy systems. So there's 3 main energy systems, and they're involved in the synthesis and utilization of ATP, right? So this is a molecule that provides energy for muscular contraction and other cellular processes. So an important thing to remember is that these 3 energy systems don't work in isolation, but rather work in varying degrees depending on kind of the intensity and duration of the activity. All right, so the first one is the anaerobic alactic system. Okay, so this is what's used, this is the predominant energy system when we have high intensity, short duration activities. It can work up to about 10 seconds. It does not require oxygen and it does not result in the accumulation of lactate. Okay, so it can work for about 10 seconds via the use of stored ATP and the synthesis of ATP via the donation of a phosphate group from phosphocreatine. Okay. The second energy system is the anaerobic lactic system. Okay, so this is high intensity beyond what the previous energy system could provide energy for. So this one can work up to about a minute or so. Still does not require the presence of oxygen. It utilizes glycogen, which is just stored carbohydrates, and it does result in the accumulation of lactate. Okay, so the third energy system is the aerobic system. This is the one we're primarily talking about today. This is the predominant energy system when you're doing low intensity activity or resting. All right, so in this one, ATP is synthesized in the mitochondria via the interaction of oxygen-specific enzymes and then fatty acids, glycogen, or amino acids, right? So fat is a really important substrate here with the aerobic system, less so with the other ones. Okay, so why do we need to do any aerobic conditioning? And follow up to that, why have running poles gotten such a bad rap then? Well, one of the important things to remember when we're talking about aerobic conditioning is that intensity is a really important variable there, right? So what we're looking for is what happens if we get too high, it becomes lactic training, not aerobic training, right? So we kind of outlined those energy systems before. So what we're looking for is we're looking to stay in the range of about 50 to 70% of max heart rates. This is like the lower end of aerobic development. It should feel really comfortable to talk, be able to breathe through your nose, et cetera, et cetera. We'll come back to this later. But what this does is it gives us a couple of benefits. So increased capillary density is one piece to this. So it allows you to maintain body heat a little bit better, right? It also increases blood flow to soft tissues, which means greater nutrient delivery and increased speed for the metabolic byproduct removal. The other piece is that we have improved recovery between our high intensity sessions via the processes outlined previously, but also via getting athletes into a parasympathetic state, right, rest and recover type state, which allows neural fatigue to dissipate. Okay, so our biggest problems with kind of poles and other cardio type training for pitchers is really the inappropriate intensity and volume. So when intensity gets too high, this is when problems start to arise, right? So we know from research that concurrent kind of endurance type training and then resistance training tends to attenuate the benefits of the strength training. So we don't maximize the benefits from strength training if our endurance training gets to be too high of an intensity. All right. So the way we can kind of combat this is making sure that it stays in the intensity range kind of outlined before. Okay. So our first problem when the intensity gets too high really involves the nervous system. Okay. So when we're doing really intense training, think lifting very heavy weights, running fast, throwing fast, whatever. It takes us about 48 to 72 hours for our central nervous system to kind of be ready for that intensity again in training, okay? So if we do kind of training that's in this kind of medium intensity zone or this kind of like lactic zone, what happens is the intensity is not high enough to drive these kind of maximal strength, power, speed adaptations that we'd be looking for. But it's too high to either enhance or at least not interfere with recovery. So we kind of get the worst of both worlds, right? We've essentially performed a high intensity training session in terms of the recovery that's going to be required. However, we haven't maximized our benefits from that. So that's really not a trade-off that's worthwhile. The next piece here is the fiber type shift that can happen. So what happens is we have, in a really general sense, type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. So type 2 are your fast twitch muscle fibers. So if we get into like kind of this middle zone training, essentially the type 2 fibers start performing the jobs of a type 1 fiber, and we can get this kind of fiber type shift towards kind of like the slower type, which is obviously a negative when our sport involves maximal outputs. The third piece to this is that pitchers tend to be on the larger side, right? And they may not have the best running form because it's not something that's necessarily required of the position. So with those two things, what we can get from this kind of high impact training, such as running poles, is we can get some kind of orthopedic issues that come from this, which really kind of tip the scales out of balance when it comes to the risk reward from this. Okay, so now to the practical application piece here, all right? So the frequency, intensity, volume, and specific means used are going to depend on the athlete and the time of year. But in general, we'll use about 2 to 3 sessions per week for most athletes. But again, the means will kind of vary depending on our goals, their needs, that kind of stuff. So the general rules for these sessions are breathe through your nose the entire time. We'll have more on this kind of down the line. Make sure you can talk comfortably the entire time, okay? Your first rep and your last rep should be performed with the same output at the same effort level the entire time. If that's not possible, then the intensity was a little too high. Along those lines, if you're not sure, kind of how to moderate the intensity, undershoot intensity. Remember, this is supposed to be low, all right? And then finally, you should feel better when you leave than when you walked in. This isn't meant to smoke you. This is meant to be a low intensity kind of means of recovery. Okay, so some of the means we use on these kind of low intensity aerobic development days are as follows. So the first one is mobility circuits. All right, so I've written and kind of talked about these in the past. These are something we use pretty frequently, especially during the season. These are great for your immobile athletes, or your athletes who can't handle the high impact stuff. And basically the way they'll work is you'll set up this circuit of mobility drills. Generally the way we'll do it is we'll alternate kind of more and less active drills back to back throughout. So like for example, you might have a bear crawl, and then you'll have that followed with like quadruped T-spine rotation, all right? And you would go kind of like in that pattern throughout the mobility circuit. So that's one option. The next option is kind of extensive plyometrics plus tempo running. All right, so this is pretty good for your athletes who maybe struggle with elasticity and rhythmic movement, that kind of thing. This will give them more exposures to this, but in kind of a controlled, higher volume environment where they can practice this more, and it also can kind of enhance that recovery as well. Generally with this, we're using kind of a 1 to 2 work to rest ratio here. The next one would be extensive medicine ball circuits. So similar idea to our extensive plyos, but for athletes maybe who need to be off their feet. Maybe they don't struggle with elasticity as much, and this is just an option because we don't want to kind of put more running on them because we're in a phase where we're doing a lot of sprint work or something along those lines. The next piece is tempo running. So this is kind of the classic. This was made famous by Charlie Francis. What you're looking to do is stay in like the 60 to 75% kind of intensity or max speed range. And you'll accumulate a decent amount of work here. So the numbers can really vary, so I'm not even going to kind of throw those out there because it really will be athlete and situational dependent. But generally you'll work for 10 to 45 seconds at a time when you're doing these. The next piece is, or the next option is weight room accessory circuits. So this is a really good option if you have kind of really crammed kind of time demands in your weight room sessions, but you have kind of this high frequency approach that you can use. So this is kind of a good option for those guys where like maybe you can only hit the really big stuff when you're higher intensity days, so you got to hit the accessories on the lower days, but you have that option to be in there a lot. That can work really well. And then kind of the last one is walking or hiking, right? Get outside, get away from training, get some vitamin D, some fresh air, be social. This can be really awesome for mental health, among other things. So which kind of method or methods you use will really be situationally dependent, right? If we're, for example, if we're early in the off season and we have a guy who really needs to work on his kind of rhythm, elasticity, all this kind of stuff, maybe on his high days we're using kind of a low volume of intensive plyos, and then on his low days we're using a relatively higher volume of extensive plyos, or tempo running, or a mix thereof. And that can kind of be a really good option early in the off season. Or maybe we have a guy who's, in a walking boot, he rolled his ankle or something like that, can't be doing kind of the higher impact methods. A medicine ball circuit can be a really good option for him. We can put him on a box, have him sit down, that kind of thing, and that can work really well for the aerobic development piece that we can still get even while he's got this kind of injury that we're dealing with. So the really important thing is don't ignore aerobic training purely because of how poorly pitchers have trained in the past and the reputation that running poles has gotten. All right, there are better ways that we can go about doing these things, and for some athletes this can really be a game changer if they're really having problems getting through, training sessions, outings, all of this, and kind of holding their performance kind of into, later innings, multiple innings, whatever it might be, or, keeping that kind of high output through a training session. This can be a big deal for them. It can really enhance their long-term development. So thank you for watching. Drop any comments or questions below, and hit that subscribe button.